Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea. The Florida Panthers keep winning hockey games, and I'm going to desperately try to finish recording this in time to catch the second half of LeBron and Curry. I am, if you haven't heard the memo, doing lists for every single faction in Warcry, and this video is going to catch all of the expansion factions from 1st edition. The first of which is Spire Tyrants, who are pretty interesting, because with just one box, it can be a little tough. They're a bit of a mid-range festival. They've got 4 of the same, like 100-point-ish fighter. And that guy's really bad. And the other issue is that the box doesn't sum to 1,000 points anymore. It sums to 1,015 points, which is super awkward. Now, there is a lot to recommend Spire Tyrants as a full faction if you like them. Because their specialists are really good. It's just the main guys that you get a ton of in the box that are just not good. So when you're thinking about cutting stuff, you get 3 pit veterans with shield, and then 1 with 2 weapons, which is pretty interesting. The one with shield, now, I actually don't mind shields in general in 2nd edition, but the pit veteran with shield is like a much worse Myrmidesh Painbringer. That's the Slaanesh fighter. I've got one right here. This is a Painbringer. It's just a much better version of that particular Spire Tyrant that you get 3 of in your list. And it's just not something you want to build around, right? You're getting, for only 5 fewer points than a Painbringer, you get 3 fewer wounds, and you deal less damage, and the Painbringers have a little bit better ability, so it's rough. If I were going to cut one of the specialists, I would probably cut the Head Claimer. Head Claimers don't suck. They're decent. It's just, you know, they're kind of in the same lane as the Bespoke Destroyer here, this beautifully painted one by Richard Gray. The thing being that they aren't quite as all-in for comboing as the Bespoke Destroyers are, and I think just for those extra 10 points, I think the Destroyer is a little bit better. Things they need is quite a few things. They're pretty slow, so they really need a treasure carrier / something to hunt down opposing treasure carriers. And they also need some staying power. They need something that isn't going to die if it gets in a fight with something pretty scary. Because your pit champion is not really ideal for holding up a, you know, for dueling an opposing scary threat. It's hard to really punish someone for playing a glass cannon and not protecting it well with something like that, because if you run up to it, you're just not fast enough to go hit it, and then you can't just take a blow from it before you then go destroy it. So a few different things are really good fits here. One is the Mindstealer Spheranx, which I think goes great, and another is the Varangard. So I've created a couple lists, like pretty basic lists with them here. The first one being 1 box and an ally. Playing the Varangard with the blade, that's the one that combos a little bit better with the double. Then the pit veteran with dual weapons. You'll know because it's the one female sculpt that isn't wearing a helmet and you put 2 weapons on it. Then you've got the Head Claimer, the Bespoke Destroyer, the Pit Fighter with the net, and the Frenzied Rager. Basically all the specialists there, the 4 specialists, and then of course your leader, who is a bit of a tax. I don't really like the leader, but it's not like completely embarrassing. He'll certainly do a job, and he's got a little bit of utility to him. For 2 boxes pure, one of the bits of feedback I got from my last video was people kind of feeling bad that I was doing mostly allies and them feeling like it was taking things off theme sometimes. On one hand, I don't know what to tell you. This is essentially with the list building rules that have come in through 2nd edition. This is what Games Workshop is telling us they want us to do, is mix and match our warbands. At the beginning of the edition, I was really tied to wanting pure lists. Now I know it's a little tougher, but I'll go back to including them because I totally get it. I mean, that was me for like 6 or 7 months. So 2 boxes pure. I would go with a pit champion. You get to do 2 pit veterans with dual weapons. You're probably going to need to play 1 pit veteran with a shield, even though they're not very good. It's just hard to make the points work without it. And then a Head Claimer, a Bespoke Destroyer, 2 pit fighters with nets, and a Frenzied Rager. So you're just kind of getting rid of some of those veterans with shield to A, get you under 1,000 points, because it's weirdly hard to do with a box of this warband, and then also kind of get some of the do-nothing expensive fighters out of there. Let's talk about where you can go with Spire Tyrants if you are willing to kind of invest a little bit more in your warband. And the first one is going to be, let's just think about what they have to build around. So they have an attack buff where the pit champion, if he gets a kill, he can give +1 attack around him. And then you've also got a netter, and one of the better netters around, actually. This one's pretty good. It's 1 per box. It's 10 wounds, which is really nice to have there, and it actually can fight, which is a little bit unusual for a netter, being 4-3-1-3, but that's really nice to have. So let's start with the attack buff. Things that you can use to pay off of it. The Bespoke Destroyers are the one that comes in faction, and that's 5 strength, 3/6 damage, and you only pay 145 points for that. You get 18 wounds, so it's actually kind of hard to take them off the table before they've gotten to do their thing. Then you've also got Head Claimers. They've got less wounds, that same 5 strength, but a little bit less damage, and 10 fewer points, so you kind of get a lot for those extra 10 points in that you're doing more damage and you have more staying power. So I prefer to be using the Bespoke Destroyers if I can, but Head Claimers aren't embarrassing if you're having a tough time making the points work with all Bestogors. Now, I talked about how their native attack buff is hard to trigger, the one from the Pit Champion. It has to kill something. The Pit Champion's not the fightiest model in town. You'll definitely trigger it sometimes, right? I mean, it can do things, but you'd like to often have a backup if this is going to be your real plan in the fight. So anything from Skaven, and then you also have Chaos Lords and Darkoath War Queens that have a really nice attack buff and are pretty reasonable fighters in their own right. The other option you can kind of do with them is a netter soup, I would call. Any good netter can really be the backbone of a good soup list. I talked about it with the Unmade in my last video, and Spire Tyrants are no exception. Now, the one issue is you only get 1 to a box, so you either have to do quite a bit of converting, which I know is some people's dream, or maybe buy a few boxes and mess around with the pit veterans to make them look like a pit fighter, something like that. But being able to actually fight sometimes in combat with your netter can be really nice. You can get into combat with an opposing chaff model, net their big heavy that's nearby, and then trust that you might actually hold up against the opposing chaff, which really isn't a terrible place to be. So that's kind of a nice little feature of the specific netter soup that you get from Spire Tyrants. Let's talk about some of these approaches, right? The first being with the Darkoath War Queen. A Pit Champion, a Darkoath War Queen, 2 Bespoke Destroyers, 2 Pit Fighters with a net, and then a Bloodkind with a Great Axe. Bloodkinds with Great Axes are really cool. You get high strength. They do 3/8, 3 for a hit, 8 for a crit on their attacks. I think they only get 3, but they're reasonably fast at 5-inch move. I know you'd prefer to have a little more speed than that, but it's at least quick and scary and has a lot of wounds, so it's really hard to take off the battlefield before it hits. It is a classic Titan model, but costed really well. And so it can be there to combo with the War Queen or the Pit Champion. You've got your 2 Bespoke Destroyers, so you have 3 really quality things where if you get your +1 attack buff on them, you feel like you really scored. And then, of course, with the Darkoath War Queen, if you are, you know, using the ability to give her an onslaught and then getting an onslaught for a Bestigor or a Bloodkind, that is incredible. It's a ton of damage output. It's a great place to be. There aren't a ton of fighters here, 7, but for a tournament where you say maybe have 2 objective missions and 2 brawling missions, that's something where these 7 fighters can definitely be pretty good. Another one I wanted to try out was Spire Tyrants, is what I'm calling it, and that's using Skaven. Scritch Spikeclaw is really solid. The Underworld's fighters that are fast are generally pretty decent because they are from the time when speed used to cost a lot less. And then the Underworld's fighters that are really tough and tanky are really terrible because, you know, tough and tanky is really good in this edition because it costs a lot less in the new points algorithm. But speed used to be really good in the previous edition because it cost so much less. And so borrowing some of the speed from the previous edition can solve a lot of Spire Tyrants' problems with being slow. And then because Scritch is a Skaven hero, you're still getting lead from the back, so you can still boost up your Bespoke Destroyer, you can still bring in a Bloodkind with Great Axe, and then you also get all this chaff, so you can do this with just one box of Spire Tyrants, Spikeclaw Swarm, and then there are so many cool Minotaurs out there that can be your Bloodkind. I think that that's a pretty cool warband. It would be pretty distinctive on the table, and it would have a lot of really strong tricks to it. I didn't even mention how Scritch can resurrect a couple of his little rats. Festering Skaven and Lurking Skaven can come back. Kirk, the Almost Trusted, can't get resurrected, but is a really quality fighter. And so there's kind of a lot going on with this list, but you can get a lot done with it. Let's go even deeper into Spire Tyrants, though, because there's a lot you can do. So I'm calling this Chaos Mirepoix, which is sort of a French soup mix. And I have never seen someone try to do this because you only get one pit fighter to a box, so you're really going to have to do a lot of converting or grabbing third-party models. I think that's probably what I would do personally. But if you had, say, 3 pit fighters with nets, I think you get a little bit decreasing marginal utility for each netter after your third, but you could do 4 or 5. And then 3 pit fighters with dagger. Now those are even better in combat. They get that 4th point of crit damage, so that makes them a little bit scarier en masse. You'd have 1 of each in each deployment group. And then you can have these incredible different soup configurations based on what you want to bring in. So you could say, keep a Bespoke Destroyer, and then just have your big dragon, your Varangard with Blade. Or you could have kind of the movement tricks with a Slaughter Priest and a Bloodkind with Great Axe. Slaughter Priest is, of course, dragging things around. The Bloodkind gets the benefit from the Pit Champion's +1 attack ability, but it also gets the benefit from if a Slaughter Priest drags something into combat with it, something like that. You can also just lean more into the attack buffs like I did on the previous page, right? You can have a Darkoath War Queen and a Fomeroid Crusher. Fomeroid Crushers are amazing when you're giving them +1 attack. You can also kind of do a more reach focused list. If you've got, say, like Reaper and like one of those hunter missions, or like Bloodmarked or something, you could get a Slangor Slakehorn and a Pyrocaster. Those have a ton of threat range. There's nowhere for an opposing small fighter to hide. You can pick off chaff really easily with that kind of configuration. Or you can do something fun where maybe you lean towards a few more nets, maybe you do 4 or 5 nets, and then you have a Witherlord, or a Trueblood for another netter if you want. But I would go with Witherlord and then an Ogroid Myrmidon, who is a great sort of attack buff recipient from the Pit Champion, but also is amazing because he's got that 2-inch reach. Now you're threatening, you have really scary... The Pit Champion has a somewhat respectable 3-inch reach attack. The Witherlord has a 2-inch reach attack. The Ogroid Myrmidon has a 2-inch reach attack and does a ton of damage and is really tough. So you're just threatening this ability to completely lock your opponent down and create these incredibly one-sided battles with that kind of full reach soup list. So there's a ton of different things you can do from this base of Pit Champion and 6 Pit Fighters that I think is secretly one of the more powerful warbands in the game in a sort of balanced battle pack, not in the Rumble pack, maybe not necessarily in the core book, although I think it would be really good in the core book, and it would be pretty reasonable in the Rumble pack as well, but in something that's more balanced between the two, I think that this is a really powerful thing to be doing. And you're going to have 9 fighters, which is a great number, and you're going to have some of the scariest things on the board, and the ability to lock down your opponent's scary things. It's just a great setup. So from that to a warband that's really hard to set up in the Khainite Shadowstalkers. So 1 box of these gets you a nice little finesse warband that I think a lot of people really love, is really, really popular, but it lacks the tools to keep itself alive. Which is really tough in a finesse warband. You want some kind of trick that's going to make you hard to take down. For example, Hunters of Huanchi have a really amazing reaction. So they're a finesse warband that can stay alive by just having tons of numbers and then using their reaction to kind of keep you from killing them. So what I would cut with Khainite Shadowstalkers is honestly almost all of it. They only have one good fighter. That's the Dark Flame Warlock with crossbows. Now, it is quite good, so there are things you can do with Khainite Shadowstalkers if you're willing to either do some converting or invest a little bit. The box does have 2 Dark Flame Warlocks with crossbows. There's 4 crossbows in there. Maybe if you want to be real crazy, you could glue the crossbows onto other things' hands that aren't Dark Flame Warlocks and call them Warlock with crossbows if you wanted, something like that. But you're a little constrained. So if you're not doing a bunch of crazy conversions, when you cut all of the really, really painfully bad fighters, you have 580 points left in your list. And you're going to want to fill that with some survivability, because like I said, the Khainite Shadowstalkers don't have the tools to keep themselves alive. And then you're going to want raw damage. The Warlock is a, very tricksy, very clever fighter. He can put damage on when there's 3 or 4 of them all shooting the same thing, but it's not going to ever be something where you reduce your opponent's numbers to 0 really quickly. So some options for you. If you just do 2 boxes, you can have, a list that can work pretty well in casual play with your Shroud Queen, your 4 Dark Flame Warlocks, and then 4 Shroud Blades with Spear. I like those here because the 2-inch reach, you're just keeping your opponent at arm's length there. With 1 box and an ally, I really like the idea of a Thunder Prime with the Grand Stave here, because that toughness 5, tons of wounds, is something that's going to have a lot of gravity on the table. It's going to really annoy your opponent. And then, you're priced into bringing some Shroud Blades there. So you'll just play those, and, they're 85 points. They're not very great, but you live with it, right? The Thunder Prime with the 2 Warlocks and the Shroud Queen is not worth 210 points, but it's not like she's a useless fighter. She can really get some work in. If the Shroud Queen was 180 points, you'd be throwing a party, right? So don't worry too bad that it's, overcosted by 15 points. If we're really getting into building them, it's tough because when you only have 1 good fighter in a warband, your build philosophy kind of changes if you're building on anything resembling a budget. If you can't just afford to throw $350 away into building a Warcry warband, then you're going to be constrained a little bit, right? So, do you want to maximize your Diablo 3 Demon Hunter vibes? You could, right? If you play 6 Warlock crossbows, you still have 160 points left for a Kharadron Overlord's ally, which could boost the damage on those crossbows, and they're just generally really good. They're usually pretty decent in their own right. Their 3-inch move isn't going to hurt that much because all the Shadowstalkers are so darn fast. The issue there is if you get a ton of Demon Hunters Warlocks, and you convert them up and the addition changes, then you're in a really tough spot, right? Because you don't have anything else, and then when they make something else the one good fighter, or they make the rest of the warband good, but they bring the Warlock down because that's what was good last edition. They almost always do this when editions change. You could be really out of luck, so you have to think about whether you're willing to put in all of that work and see it potentially go up in smoke. So then if you kind of mulligan this edition, or you just live with having kind of a weaker warband, that protects you from changes. But do you want something that you're probably not going to take to a tournament and would just only keep for narrative play? That's up to you, right? You can also use Underworlds if you want something elfy. Skaith and Mayari have reasonably costed elf bodies that are using the old algorithm before elves were terrible. So that can be pretty decent. Here's kind of an example of what I would do if I were trying to take Khainite Shadowstalkers to a tournament. I'd play a Shroud Queen, 6 Warlocks, and an Aether Chemist. Aether Chemists have a pretty short 6-inch reach attack, but it is really good and it does a lot of damage. And they only move 3 inches, but they can pop Fight for Profit. That boosts up your Dark Flame Warlock damage. Now you actually have enough damage potentially to actually hurt your opponent's warband, as opposed to just snipe one thing off the board each round. So this is a pretty powerful list, a pretty annoying list to play against because you're so fast and you're only attacking from range. You will, if you take this to a tournament, at some point in the later rounds, you will have that classic experience of someone beating you and hating you because your warband is so unfun to play against. But hey, if you love Hunters of Huanchi, you'll love these. Scions of the Flame. Really solid fighters, but really overcosted damage abilities there. What I would cut is a lot of the things that are trying to have their abilities, because the damage abilities are not good. So, for example, the Inferno Priest is an awful fighter. The Immolator, the classic, it was probably the best fighter points for point last edition. Now it's a lot worse. The ability Inferno, it's really only worth it if you proc it twice. Giving yourself a legitimate chance to actually make that happen means catching 4 enemies in the blast. That's only ever going to happen in a really extreme swarm meta, and in that case, I mean, it's just not likely, but keep it in your back pocket if that's what your local meta is like. If people around you only ever play Rumble Pack and, you know, you just want to swarm bodies and have an Immolator and just get into big team fights and try to roll hot on the Immolator. I don't think that's the most powerful thing you can really do in the Rumble Pack, but it's defensible at least. Then the regular Fireborn, I'm not that excited about either. What they need, the first thing is speed. They're all move 4. And then the second thing is tankiness. They're pretty solid. I mean, they don't just die immediately, but they are a little bit, you know, ephemeral, like the flame, right? They die faster than most of the other sort of we're tough combat guys, warbands that are out there. And so with 405 points available after cuts, I would bring in a Fomeroid Crusher. This is going to start getting repetitive because I'm often thinking of Fomeroid Crusher or Varangard when it comes to one box of a Bespoke Warband and an ally. It's not that those are necessarily the best things in Chaos. It's just that they're so good at doing the things that almost every old Bespoke Warband is awful at. Bespoke Warbands are kind of built to a formula. That formula is not necessarily ineffective. You can absolutely make really strong lists with that formula, but it is repetitive, and so it has the same weaknesses every time. And so Fomeroid Crushers and Varangards are really good at covering those weaknesses. Then you could play a Brazen Champion. Those are pretty good now. The Fireborn with Chris, that's the one that doesn't have the bad ability, but has kind of a decent chaff killer stat line. And then an Initiate with the Flame Pot, the Initiate with the Morning Star. It comes with one Initiate that you sort of aren't encouraged to convert, but it's really easy to just clip off the tip of her weapon, attach the Morning Star to it, and then build the guy with the Flame Pot. Normally the guy with the Flame Pot can either be Flame Pot or Morning Star, but you just build him as Flame Pot, attach your Morning Star to the what is it, Fire Brazier Initiate, and there you go. If you don't want to convert your Initiates, you can play an Inferno Priest instead of the Immolator, and then ally in a Varangard instead of the Fomo Crusher. Inferno Priests are so much worse than Immolators, though, so that I would want to avoid doing that because the Inferno Priest is so terrible. Now, there's a few different things you can do with building them. They're actually a lot like if Slaves to Darkness and Spire Tyrants kind of had a baby. So the first thing, I kind of mentioned this before with chaff builds, but the Fire Pot versus the Morning Star, I think, are the two best ways to build your two chaff models, the Initiates. Basically, you decide whether or not you want 3-inch reach or you want access to a pretty poor damage ability, but there's some value there to having options. I know people who really like giving up a tiny bit of stats if they can to get access to another ability, even if they're not going to use it. Just having the option to use it, knowing that maybe some opponents will play around it when they shouldn't, things like that. Some people really like that kind of play style. Personally, you know, I find unless you've played a warband a whole bunch of times, it can be hard to keep a ton of different abilities in my head. So I prefer to sort of just have the better stat model if the ability is not really good. But that's kind of a relic of the fact that I switch warbands so often. I think if you're gonna, you know, really specialize in a warband, you can maybe find some more value there. The 65-point versions just generally are massively preferable. The Brazier is just not worth the extra 5 points. My thing of why the ability is not great, throw Firebomb is just going to be less damage almost every time than just doing an onslaught on a Blazing Lord or a Brazen Champ. But again, it's situational. Now for building them, they're a little bit better at actually building around an attack buff than the Spire Tyrants are, because the actual ability itself is much easier to trigger. The Blazing Lord doesn't have to get a kill to trigger the ability, and the Blazing Lord is just a much better fighter than a pit champion. Now, the chaff is tough because the nets of Spire Tyrants are probably better than having 3-inch reach on the Scions of the Flame. Now, Scions do have a good reaction, though. So, chaff warbands with good reactions really go up, in my estimation, and so Scions of the Flame are solid in that way. The reaction is sort of the anti-counter, where if they hit you, they take 1. If they crit you, they take 2. So it can deal a lot more damage than counter if your warband has low toughness, which your cheap fighters in this warband do have low toughness. So that's a great place to be. The one sort of stumbling block if you're going to be trying to do an attack buff warband with Scions of the Flame is that your Brazen Champions are not as good as your Bespoke Destroyers. Those are kind of the within faction option for getting a lot of money out of boosting your attacks. Basically, you pay 15 points for 2 inches of reach, and otherwise they're the same. 2-inch reach is great. I think it's really good. But 15 points is a lot if you want to include 2 of them in your list. The things you can get for 15 points when you're looking at sort of the best allies in Chaos, 15 points can actually get you a long way. And so, and then, of course, including 2 of them, 30 points gets you a lot of stuff when it comes to allies. So that's kind of the one tax there, is your Brazen Champs are not as good as your Bespoke Destroyers, but everything else about building this can be pretty nice. And the exact same allies are going to be good with Scions of the Flame that are really good with Spire Tyrants if you're not relying on the Spire Tyrant net ability, right? So things like a Fomeroid Crusher, things like a, well, this is actually my list, not things like, this is the list. Fomeroid Crushers, Great Axe Bloodkinds, the Lord of Plagues, which is a Nurgle hero, Ogroid Myrmidons, Varanguards with Blades, Centaurian Marshals, although I would put them a little lower than the other guys on this list, but they are solid. Doom Bulls, Lord of Pain, that's out of Slaanesh, Lord of Afflictions, a Nurgle model, and then the Slaughterborn with Great Axe. That's the leader of the Darkoath Savagers. All of those are really, really good in any sort of attack buff build that you want to build out of Scions of the Flame, out of Slaves to Darkness also really loves all of these guys as allies. So a few things you can do with these. One is if you want to do a pure list, right, you can kind of have a lot of initiates, 2 stars, 2 pots with just 2 boxes, a Fireborn with Chris, 2 Brazen Champions, and a Blazing Lord. If I wanted to take them into the Rumble Pack and only had 2 boxes, I would go with a Blazing Lord, a Slaughterborn with Great Axe, just an ally from Darkoath, but almost any like scary barbarian man with an axe can pretend to be a Slaughterborn with Great Axe. Then I'd bring a great Brazen Champion, 2 Fireborns with Chris, and 4 Initiates. The reason I like Fireborn with Chris, generally, but more in the Rumble Pack, which for those who don't know, I get comments about this for every video where I mention it. The Rumble Pack is a free PDF of objective missions, so it's a very specific way to play. Not everyone likes it, but they're generally pretty well designed objective missions. And the catch with them is you want as many numbers as possible. So numbers can be hard to come by with Scions of the Flame because the Blazing Lord is 200 points. The Brazen Champion is kind of your real offense, and it's 165 points. It can be hard to stack numbers with that, but getting to 9 fighters can be really nice. And then if you're not quite as worried about it, you can get down to 8 fighters and do this really wild, I call it sizzling beef, because it's flame themed with Scions, but you bring in 2 Bloodkinds with Great Axe, those 235 point fighters that do so well when you buff their attacks, and you can do some pretty silly things with your Bloodkinds, and the Blazing Lord who gives out attack buffs and doesn't have nearly as hard a time doing it. Now let's get into Tarantulos Brood. 1 box of them gets you a pretty tricksy little control list. It's based on this kind of speedsters and attrition. It's a really interesting playstyle. Now, I think the resurrection nerf kind of hurt them a little bit because it's all about sort of leveraging these spiders in a really interesting way, and then you have nets to your disposal too. But one of the things you do with spiders is kind of send them forward, and then when they die, you happily resurrect them. But now that's a little bit more difficult than it used to be. If I'm cutting stuff, I would cut some Broodkin. Now, I wouldn't cut all my Broodkin, because the box gives you 6 of them for some reason. I shouldn't say that. I complain with so many other boxes that you don't get enough chaff, like with Spire Tyrants or Scions only getting 2 of their 65-point fighter. Broodkin are nice. The problem is, Toughness 3, 8 wound fighters can be a bit of a liability if they cost more than 60 points, and Broodkin cost 65 points. So it's really easy to lose them. Pretty cheap fighters can take them out in 1 round, which is just not where you want to be if you're losing 65 points to like 1 action, or just the action of a really, 2 actions from a really cheap fighter. Not a great place to be, but they're not the worst. You just wouldn't want to lean on them a ton. So I wouldn't cut all of them, but I would cut 2 or 3 of them for sure. One thing to note, the Sai, which is the cooler looking weapon, is strictly worse than the Knives, which is the weapon that doesn't look very cool. This is of course always how it works with GW. Things they need. I would say the main thing they need is point-for-point efficiency. They have a lot of things that are powerful in this game, like they have lots of numbers, they have lots of interesting abilities, actually multiple great abilities, but they just have really below-rate profiles in terms of the amount of wounds, the amount of damage output that you get for the points you're paying, and part of that is because they're paying for these amazing abilities. So, if you forgot to put the Fomoroid Crusher on your bingo card before, put it on now. 1 box and an ally. If I was just going to do kind of a low-rent Tarantulos Brood, I would do the Fomoroid Crusher. A Broodmaster, 2 of the Doomweavers with net, 4 Spider Swarms, 2 Broodkins, and that Fomoroid Crusher. You can use the bits off of people's cloaks to make your 4th spider. That's how I would do it. Because it comes with 3 spiders, but there's just so many tiny little spiders on people's bodies for like little bits and bobs. You can just mush them together to get your 4th spider. Now, if you're kind of building a little bit more with them, one thing to note, they are kind of victims of addition over correction, right? They were the most powerful thing in the game in 1st edition. By far, they were the most powerful warband in the game. But they took a lot of nerfs because basically the way they work is they have 2 abilities that are on rate really, really good, but the problem is they're dedicated to force multiplying something that is now a really tiny force, which is the spider model. You can resurrect a spider model, you can give spider models bonus actions, but you're really only doing it for a 50-point fighter, which is just not a lot of impact for your dice, even if it's a great rate for total activations per dice, those activations just don't count for much. Before, you were doing these on a 35-point model that was worth 65 points. And it was good because A, you were way more points efficient than everybody else. And then B, you're getting these, yes, it's 65-point models on these force multiplier things, but it's still good because you just have these models everywhere on the board. The way they are now, they're not terrible. Tarantulos Brood are pretty respectable. They just don't really stand out quite the same way because you're not excited to use Scuttling Symbiosis or Creeping Summons, and those are sort of the point of the warband. It's sort of everything is built around using those two abilities. And they're both locked to Spider Swarm, so it's not like you can bring in a Thrall to then use the abilities on the Thrall like you can with, say, Untamed Beasts, for example. So again, they are very playable. They have a really high floor, right, because 13 models, lots of cheap utility abilities. They have nets. You cannot be a terrible faction. You can't even really be a bad faction if you have 50-point chaff and nets, even if the 50-point chaff aren't very special. But they also just have this low ceiling because you're not getting away with anything. You don't have, none of your abilities are all that interesting in terms of what you use them on, even though they're really powerful in concept, I would say. Now let's get into their rivals, the Darkoath Savagers. And one box of Darkoath Savagers gives you maybe the most beloved first edition warband in the game. I think these guys are the most popular because of Conan. They have so much cool factor, but they're full of traps. Darkoath Savagers are pretty bad. They have a ton of tournament play, consistently below 500 always. There's only been a couple people who have ever gotten more than 2 wins out of Darkoath Savagers, and they have been taken to a lot of tournaments. I've been compiling the data, and they are, maybe not one of the 3 most popular warbands in the game, but they are definitely in the top 6 or 7, and they're consistently losing. And I think the reason that they lose so much isn't that they are necessarily the worst faction, but it's that the thing that is cool about them is incredibly weak. The God Speaker is, every time someone reads Darkoath Savagers, they look at the God Speaker ability, Visions of Glory, and they just go like, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I need to try this. I'm going to get so many wild dice. I'm going to bury my opponent in wild dice. And Visions of Glory is one of the worst abilities in the game. Let me tell you why. Visions of Glory, one, the rate is not great. You have to have double 5s or double 6s to really expect to get positive value in terms of future wild dice out of it, right? You're using a double to hope to get more than 1 wild dice in the future. Almost always you use your double and you get 1. A lot of the time you use your double and you get none, which is a real disappointing thing. A lot of people swear by, well, in round 1 I'm not really using my doubles anyway, and so then I just use Visions of Glory and I get a free wild dice. That's great. God Speaker is over 100 points. Would you pay 100 points for 1 wild dice? You would not. The God Speaker is a terrible fighter. Terrible fighter. And you have to think about how much better it is to play a warband that actually might use that double for something and get value out of it. You have to think about how rough it is to have this sort of ball and chain on your warband, that the ability is terrible for round 2, 3, and 4. You have to think about, if you are going to try to use it in round 2 or round 3 to, stack your wild dice for the last round. It's not just the ability that you're using, whether or not you get a future wild dice. It is the fact that you are giving up having used an ability right now. You're not just paying the dice that you used. You are paying the opportunity of what you could have used those dice on. This is why you can't take out a loan without having to pay it back in interest, right? Because you know, current money is worth more than future money, so you need more future money to make up for the current money. The same is true with dice, and the interest rate on Visions of Glory is just not worth what is actually happening in a 4-round game. The same is actually true of the other Darkoath Savagers ability, the one that gives you a +1 attack forever. It's okay if you're stumbling across it, but it's really not good if you are sort of purposefully changing how you play in hopes of getting it. It's just not going to work. You're going to, you know, maybe you're going to kill something, but then the round keeps going. They get a bunch of attacks onto your person. It's very rare that you get more than just an onslaught out of that ability. As far as the rest of them, their fighters are not terrible. Nothing really stands out as being a ton worse than the rest. I hate the Wrath Touched because I hate 1/5 profiles. They're so annoying. I know it averages out to being like not a bad fighter, but 1/5 profiles, I just absolutely hate them. I wish they weren't even in the game. I like the Proven. They're pretty interesting, and if you stumble into the +1 attack with some of the Proven, they can be really good, like the Proven with the Axe. Again, don't change how you play to do this. I think a big part of why Darkoath Savagers lose so much is that they tempt you into playing poorly. So just use them, and if you use the abilities, it's gravy. Now what they need is, they need abilities, right? Because you have all these abilities that are so cool to read with Darkoath Savagers that are desperately asking you to use them, and the most important thing that you can do when you play Darkoath Savagers is not use their abilities. So you need some other abilities that you're actually going to spend dice on. The other thing they need is power projection. Again, they're, you know, 4-inch move like so many of the Bespoke warbands. So they need that kind of either ranged attack or speed. So if I'm taking one box of them, if you forgot it on your bingo card before, you got it now. The Varangard with Blade. Then I'd use a Slaughterborn with a Great Axe. The Conan Proven. You can do Flail or Sword. And then a Proven with Great Axe. Then 4 Glory Seekers, 2 with the Spear, and 2 with Sword and Shield. This is going to be just a solid, all-around little warband. Really solid for narrative play. You know, not necessarily breaking down the doors competitively, but working towards the Varangard with Blade in your narrative games is going to be really good. You'll usually get it after like 3 or 4 games. And then this is useful enough that you could take it to a tournament, although there's more you can do with Darkoath Savagers. Now again, none of the abilities are worth using, as I said before, but because everything is kind of worthwhile, any 2 allies you bring in are going to be useful once you cut a few things. Any situation where you bring in an Underworld's warband is going to be really solid. What I really wish they would do with Darkoath Savagers is break up Slaves to Darkness and use that to build up Darkoath Savagers, or just have a separate sort of faction called Darkoath. Now, I know this doesn't fit one-to-one with AOS, but who cares? We're our own game. We have the Stormcast broken up in a way that makes no sense and doesn't fit with with AOS at all. And Slaves to Darkness is getting too big. So why not break them up and kind of build up Darkoath? You could bring in the Godsworn Hunt, which is the Underworld's warband. You could bring in the Darkoath Chieftain. You could bring in the Darkoath War Queen. That's a bunch of options now. And then you'd have a ton of buildings you can do, right? Because the Darkoath War Queen has a really cool build around ability. So if she was naturally in faction, you could use her as the leader. Although the Darkoath Savagers leader is amazing. I can't believe I got through Darkoath Savagers without talking about how good the Slaughterborn with Great Axe is. It's definitely one of the best Bespoke leaders. But then you just have multiple good abilities in the Godsworn Hunt. You can check out my tournament report about the tournament that I won with Stormcast Eternals. I my one non-win was a draw against a mostly Godsworn Hunt Darkoath Savagers list that was really cool. Tons of cool abilities there. You'd have a bunch of cool build paths if they did that. Unfortunately, we can't have nice things, so that's not how it is. You can do sort of boosting up your great weapons. So the great axe is not bad when you give it +1 attack. This is sort of the +1 attack video, to be honest. It's not necessarily that that's something I always like to do. It's more that just these are the factions that do it, and this was, I guess, sort of the latest design space that was in their head when they were designing these things, right? Because they all came out around the same time, and they all have essentially the same strengths and weaknesses in terms of Darkoath Savagers, Scions of the Flame, and Spire Tyrants. So, a Slaughterborn with Great Axe, a Darkoath War Queen, who should be in Darkoath anyway, a Proven with Great Spear, 2 Proven with Great Axe, a Glory Speaker with a Spear, and the Wrath Touched, who I hate, but hey, it fits the points. That is all of the first edition expansions for the Bespoke teams, which means I've done every single Bespoke team that came out in first edition. My next piece of this series is going to be doing all the Bespoke teams that have come out in second edition. So I may actually... you get to see me editing myself mid-video. I won't cut this. What I'm actually going to do is I'll have the next edition be one of the 4 Grand Alliances, and then I'll get into the Bespokes from second edition after we've seen a little bit more from the recent reveals of a new Flesh Eater Courts and new Stormcast Eternals warband that have just come out. And so I'll wait for those until we get a better sense of kind of what's in those boxes. I'll maybe do Destruction and or Death before I get into the second edition Bespokes. But I will cover every Bespoke warband. They'll have their own videos, and then the Grand Alliance AOS warbands will have their own videos. So, you know, for example, once I do Order, don't expect to see Hunters of Huanchi in there. Don't expect to see Khainite Shadowstalkers in there. So, until then, may all your rolls be crits, and I will come out with other non-list building videos in the future as well. I mentioned in this video that I've been taking tournament stats. We are finally starting to have enough stats since the last FAQ, where which really did shake up the meta a little bit, where we can actually start to say things about, you know, how factions are doing in this new world, and I'm pretty excited to do a video about that. So until then, may all your rolls be crits.